So the Football World Cup, the greatest show on earth, pretty much started out on this tiny, unremarkable residential street in the suburbs of Montevideo, capital of Uruguay. This goal here shows where the first ever World Cup goal was scored by Lucien Laurent, a Frenchman, against Mexico in 1930. Games played at the Parc Central nearby. The final was at the Estadio Centenario, where I will end this video. But the first ever goal was scored here at Positos. It's now all residential, as you can see. But about 20 years ago, a historian kind of found the location and built it after a lot of research. The first World Cup was basically a massive experiment. There was only 13 teams. They travelled, some of them from Europe by boat. It took them weeks. And little Uruguay was chosen to host it because it just won the 1924 and 1928 World Cups. Football, which was invented in England, it was big in lots of Europe by that point, but in South America, in Uruguay and Argentina and Brazil, it was booming, and they'd become really good at it really quickly. This has all completely changed, right? In 2026, in the US, Canada, Mexico, there's 48 teams spanning continents, spanning time zones. It'll be very, very political in all sorts of ways. It'll be the greatest show on earth. The final will be played in a stadium, giant stadium just outside New York. My name's Joey Durso. I'm a journalist who writes about football and money, power, politics. I recently wrote a book called More Than a Shirt. So yeah, I want to talk about what's changed, how the World Cup went from here to the giant stadium and to being the greatest show on earth. I'm afraid to keep using because I like it. And I walked to the Estadio Centenario, which is a few streets away. Yeah, so I want to talk through three of the big changes that have happened between 1930 and 2026. And they are, firstly, the scale of the World Cup. Secondly, the travel involved. Thirdly, the money. Fourth, the politics. And then fifth, the kind of fan experience and how it changes for people following the World Cup. Who's following the World Cup? Which is maybe the most interesting one. So stick around. I just spent a while in Brazil. I'm on my way to Argentina, just trying to watch as many matches as I can, trying to learn as much about Latin American football as I can. And yeah, Uruguay has always completely fascinated me because I suppose, unlike Brazil and Argentina, it's a country you don't hear much about aside from football, but any football fan knows, like 2 World Cups. It's more than England, that's more than Spain, more than all sorts of football countries that have never won it. Yeah, it's not really a country you hear about in any other context. Yeah, so how have things changed since 1930, since Uruguay not just hosted it, but won it on home soil? You know, the 2 dates, 1930 and 1950, when Uruguay won, are still so iconic here. People talk about them all the time, see them on T-shirts. Yeah, so the first obvious way that it's changed is the scale of it. There were only 13 teams. There was Uruguay, the USA, France, Mexico. There was no England, even though England kind of invented the game. They were quite huffy about it, high-handed. The ongoing disputes between football being amateur and professional. But basically the English thought the game, they thought the home nations tournament between England, Scotland, Wales was basically the World Cup. That was all the relevant football nations. They didn't fancy travelling to the other side of the world to play teams like Uruguay. The upcoming World Cup is the first expanded one from 32 teams to 48 teams, which will make it all a bit of a mess. It will mean kind of overlapping fixtures at, multiple games happening simultaneously. It'll be pretty hard to follow. I mean, as a football fan, I'm kind of incredibly excited because World Cups are just amazing and there'll be games on all the time. But there's also, I think, some legitimate criticism that it's kind of watering down the product. It will make the early games less meaningful, that all the good teams will kind of get out of their group pretty easily, which the Football World Cup now simply is the biggest thing in the world, the biggest event there is in the world. You can compare it to the Olympics, but the World Cup final certainly is watched by more people. Certainly a more sort of obsessive fandom element to it. Like, people are happy when someone from their country wins a gold medal, but it's not the same as seeing your team win a match in the World Cup. It's much more of a sort of team sport rather than an individualized thing. I love the Olympics. I'm not slagging off the Olympics, but yeah, the Olympics is a really interesting part of the World Cup's origin story because football came from England to South America around the turn of the century, 1900, a little bit before that, but certainly formalised and popular in Brazil, Uruguay, Argentina around then. Uruguay is just so much smaller than Argentina and Brazil that it's obviously not as good at football, but back then the population was kind of closer. It was still smaller, but not as small. But Uruguay, the really big moment was Uruguay winning the 2 Olympics in 1924 in Paris and 1928 in Amsterdam. And people talk about that everywhere here still now, because that's kind of the origin story of Uruguayan football. And that's kind of the reason why Uruguay offered to host the World Cup, wanted to host the World Cup, and why FIFA thought they would be a good host, because it was, a kind of proper football country. It was almost a reward. There's also a neat symbolism in the fact that Uruguay, the Centenario Stadium, for the 1930 World Cup. Centenario, the centenary of the founding of Uruguay, the constitution was formed in 1830. And of course, that means that in 2030, it'll be 200 years of Uruguay, 100 years since the first World Cup final. And so FIFA is staging some early games in South America, including one here in Centenario, where I'm walking towards now. But most of the games will be Spain, Portugal, Morocco. It just shows how huge and global this thing is now. Everyone wants a piece of it. We've got a slightly weird situation where Uruguay is hosting a match, but not most of the tournament, which will be thousands of miles away in Europe and North Africa. So that's the scale of it. I said I'll talk about 5 big ways the World Cup has changed since 1930. Another one is the travel, right? Like, Now you can fly across anywhere in the world in a day or so, pretty easy. But back then you had to get a boat for weeks on end. It was expensive. There wasn't a lot of money in football at all. So there are countries that didn't participate for that reason. And it was a huge culture shock. People wouldn't have left their hometown or home country before. So there was always a huge, I think, sort of home bias to international football back then. So the role of travel just so different. And the third thing I want to talk about is money, which partly just sort of ferry fares and things like that. People were pretty skint that were trying to come across here to play football, but the money just now is obscene. Footballers paid hundreds of thousands of pounds, dollars, euros a week, but back then they were just kind of normal people. They were like butchers, or on the Uruguayan team was a marble cutter, I think. Just kind of, and a lot of them died in sort of relative poverty a couple of decades later. They weren't the sort of global super celebs they are now. The money involved was so much smaller, and I suppose that is why a little country like Uruguay was capable of winning. Another way in which the World Cup has changed is just how political it all is. The World Cup international sport has always been political. Yeah, and another way it's changed, but I guess in some ways it hasn't changed, is the politics of it. Because football is so political now. If you look at FIFA and corruption and the way that sort of Qatar and Russia hold recent tournaments, the USA and President Trump is going to be plastered all over the upcoming tournament. In 1930 in Uruguay, it was a very sort of amateurish affair. It was really important for the Uruguayan government, and it's hugely important politically to Uruguay even now. You still see T-shirts with 1950 on it. The two seminal dates in Uruguayan football history are 1930, when the country hosted the World Cup and won it, but even more significantly, perhaps even more shockingly, perhaps, winning in Brazil in 1950, what Brazilians call the Maracanazo, the shock or the tragedy of the Maracanã, the national stadium. And the idea that little Uruguay could win twice, it's just so important. It's this country's founding myth, it's its origin story. If you ask a foreigner what do they know about Uruguay, the most likely answers are going to be nothing, or they've won 2 World Cups. And it's so part of the story. And I think in countries that maybe have big leagues now, like England, Spain, Italy, the sort of myths of decades or a century ago kind of fade into the past pretty quickly, but it feels like everyone in Uruguay knows about 1930 at the Centenario and 1950 at the Maracanã. As for the politics of it, it's not fair to say that football didn't used to be political. In 1934, the World Cup was hosted by fascist Italy under Mussolini. A couple of years later in 1936, the Olympics were held in Berlin. I actually just went to Berlin and made a video about that, if you want to watch about that fascinating football stadium story. I'm making videos like this from all over the world, so please do subscribe if you want to see more of them. So football has always been political, but now it's pretty in your face, isn't it? It's pretty obnoxious. And I think that's going to be a really interesting topic when the World Cup comes into the US, because the US is obviously very polarized. A lot of the people there love Donald Trump. A lot of people absolutely don't. And one thing I find quite interesting is, kind of seems to me like the sorts of people who don't like Donald Trump are the sort of liberal cosmopolitan types that have always been more interested in football than the traditional Republican Trump voters. So it's kind of, I find that whole dynamic pretty interesting. So I'm getting towards the Centenario now. I can just about see it in the distance. There's a massive concert on here tonight. The Centenario being the national stadium of Uruguay, where that final in 1930 was. There's a Puerto Rican singer called Cheyenne here tonight. I've never heard of him. Not being Latin American, maybe I'm not the right demographic, but he's here tonight. So there's lots of street closures and that sort of thing. The Centenario, which is this sort of jewel in the crown of Uruguayan football culture, history, whatever. A lovely place, Montevideo. I spent a week here. Very relaxing. I love Brazil and Argentina, but quite chaotic, whereas Montevideo, far from chaotic. The last thing I want to talk about is the sort of fan experience, I suppose, of being at the World Cup or watching at the World Cup, because it's just the biggest thing. And in the US, Mexico, Canada, people who are watching on TV, streaming, clips on social media, radio maybe to a lesser extent, reading about the papers, it's just such a media phenomenon. And the people watching the stadiums are important, of course, but a tiny minority of those who will be enjoying it. Some kids playing football in there, some with Nacional shirts, some with Peñarol, the 2 big teams of Uruguay. Also lots of the classic clubs you'd expect, Real Madrid, Bayern Munich. I did notice one of those kids had a Real Madrid shirt with Valverde on, Fede Valverde, the Real Madrid player, who is of course one of the current great bright hopes of Uruguayan football, alongside, I suppose, Darwin Nunez and various others. It's not quite the golden generation of Diego Forlan, Luis Suarez, but still lots of great players in this Uruguayan team. And I think that's another point actually to make about Uruguayan football, is that it's not all just nostalgia and history. and a team that was really good in 1930 and 1950. You know, since then they've been kind of up and amongst it. You know, in 2010 they reached the World Cup semi-final in South Africa, a notorious handball where Luis Suarez on the goal line against Ghana. But yeah, they're a good team still, and they compete in the Copa America. They won it in 2011 in Argentina. So yeah, it's not just a sort of nostalgia fest. I think because of the tiny population, it's hard to imagine them winning the World Cup anytime soon. I mean, the population is now much smaller relative to Brazil and Argentina, but still, a country of 3.5 million people, and they're still competitive, so I think that's pretty impressive. But yeah, I'm rambling. I was talking about the fan experience. And yeah, now it's just this massive global thing, but back then it kind of wasn't. And the people in the stadiums were a much higher proportion of those following it around the world. I mean, it was really radio in the early days of football that was the big one. It wasn't until 1958 in Sweden that the World Cup was on TV, but only broadcast live in Sweden. It was on a tape delay. I mean, 1966, when you had the World Cup in England, it was on TV in England. You know, these things were starting to change in the 60s with technology, with satellites. Yeah, the big one was 1970 in Mexico, because that was the first World Cup broadcast in colour. And if you watch that famous goal from that famous game, Brazil 4, Italy 1, Brazil's third World Cup of 4 attempts, Pele, of course, there for all 3. Yeah, it's in colour. That's the big thing. The World Cup was in colour, and that kind of completely changed the game. I think when you talk to people who were around that time, just the sort of visceral image and the yellow shirts and the whatever else, that was a big moment in World Cup kind of media history. Yeah, I've just got out off that busy road into this lovely park. The Centenario Stadium looms just behind me. You can't quite see it yet, but I'm close to it, where that first World Cup final took place in 1930. Yeah, so the fan experience has gone from being kind of refracted through a billion screens, smartphone, TV, laptop, whatever, to something that was very much kind of grounded in a place, grounded in Uruguay. And I think that's a big difference that's happened between the first World Cup and the most recent ones. Is it's gone from feeling like something that happened in Uruguay or in Italy or in England or wherever, to somewhere that happens in sort of FIFA land, this sort of disembodied airport lounge nowhere. And if you watch sort of the most recent World Cups, and I was just in the Maracanã Stadium a couple of weeks ago, probably the most iconic football stadium of all time, and it was amazing, and it was an incredible experience watching Fluminense against Botafogo. But you did sort of feel like it could have been anywhere. It could have been in Johannesburg in South Africa, where the 2010 World Cup final was held, 2014 in the Maracanã, just this sort of generic bowl. So that was a bit of a sort of sad moment, I guess. But the first World Cup wasn't like that. It felt incredibly Uruguayan, and people came incredible distances to be here. Yeah, so I'm pretty much here now. You can see the floodlights behind me of the Estadio Centenario. Cheyenne, this Puerto Rico singer, is performing here tonight. There's a massive queue. They all seem to be women, interestingly. Read into that what you will. But here I am outside this iconic venue in Uruguayan football, iconic venue in world football, back from the goalpost in the residential area where the first tournament was held in 1930 on the pitch that is now a bunch of houses, to here, which very much still exists and will be hosting a game in the 2030 World Cup. Yeah, that's the story of how the World Cup has changed. Yeah, my name's Joey Durr, so please do follow me if you want to see more of these stories about football, culture, politics and power.